All right, guys, welcome to our notes today over the Constitution. We're going to be talking about the 7 principles of the Constitution today and how that was applied in the actual document. So let's start with our notes. If something's in green, write it down. If the entire background is in green, copy down the entire slide. If I highlight something, go ahead and copy that down as well. Alrighty, so the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, this is the document that we're going to be talking about today, and it outlines the U.S. government. The the Constitutional Convention was a meeting of representatives from around the new American, former British colonies, these new American colonies that were getting together trying to create a government. So the Articles of Confederation was what we talked about last week. That was the first attempt at outlining the government. But we talked about all the problems with that. So when they got together to review it and see if they could fix them, they realized that they needed a whole new government, and that was when they created the U.S. Constitution. So this is one of your vocab words, 1787. So let's write down that that was when the U.S. Constitution was written and adopted. All right, so we talked about the Articles of Confederation, some of the problems that it had last week. So when they started to realize that they wanted to fix these problems, the Constitution realized they were going to need to compromise in many ways. A compromise is a settlement of a dispute by each party giving up some demands. So we'll talk about a couple examples of that in the Constitutional Convention, and then we'll talk about some of the ways they fixed it with the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So, compromise at the convention. There were a couple instances of compromise. The first were these two separate plans. You had one plan that was called the Virginia Plan, in which the legislature would be based on state population, right? Fixing this problem that we had with the Articles of Confederation. The next plan was the New Jersey Plan. And this had a legislature with each one, similar to the Articles of Confederation, each one had one vote. And so what happened was we created a compromise out of this. We used both plans and created a bicameral legislature that had two houses, one based on population and one with equal representation. And that was the Great Compromise. So in addition, we also had the Three-Fifths Compromise. So you had some southern states that had very small population, but a very large slave population. And then some of the northern states had zero slave population. So they didn't want to count slaves because they wouldn't be voting. But then the southern states didn't want to be, to lose out because of small populations of actual voting, slave owning populations. So they decided on each slave would represent a three-fifths of a person counting towards representation, and they agreed to revisit the slave question down the road. And so this is kind of an overview of the Great Compromise. You had the New Jersey Plan, the Virginia Plan, and the Great Compromise. And remember, that's a bicameral legislature that was created, half favoring larger states, half favoring smaller states. Three-Fifths Compromise, you had slaves wanting to be counted by southern states, and then the compromise was that three-fifths of slaves would be counted, making both the southern states and the northern states happy in this regard. All right, so let's get to our 7 key constitutional principles. So the Founding Fathers incorporated these ideas into the Constitution, and we're going to be looking at each one. Number 1, separation of powers. Which branch of government has which power. So you have duties and responsibilities divided up into three branches between the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. So this, in effect, fixed the problems that the Articles of Confederation had with only being a one-branch government. So if you ever get any questions and prompts about um, this principle of the Constitution, examples will describe only what one branch can do. And we'll see why that is next because we have another principle of the Constitution coming up. So Congress was limited under the Articles of Confederation and what they could raise through taxes and what they could do. But there were a lot of powers that were withheld. And so let's talk about the three branches of government that are created in this new Constitution. So separating the three branches, you had not just the legislative branch, but you had a bicameral legislature, and then you had the executive branch, which is our president, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. The executive branch is going to enforce the laws, and so E to E, executive to enforce. The legislative branch is going to make the laws. So if you're looking at the alphabet, L comes right next to M, and then the judicial branch interprets the laws. So that's the Supreme Court, and J is right next to I. And so that's how I kind of remember which branch does what. I. Now we have concept 2, checks and balances. So this is how each branch can have some authority over the other branches. So in these examples, I'll tell you how one branch checks up on the other, but you'll have two branches listed. For example, you have the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional, while the legislative branch can impeach judges. So this checks and balances is defined as a structure that gives each of the branches some kind of degree of oversight or control. A lot of times you'll hear these keywords like veto. The president can veto legislation, and the legislature can veto and override vetoes. All right, so you'll see here this you have both what they can do, which is the separation of powers, and then you have their checks and balances over here as well. And so this is an example of both separation of power and checks and balances. Alrighty, so concept 3 is federalism. Federalism is how power is shared between federal and state governments. So you have national and state governments that share powers. Examples are usually going to include examples that say only the federal government or only the state government, or it'll have that keyword in there, shared powers. So a lot of times it'll have that keyword in there. And this basically just tells you what each level of government can do and what the other one can do. A lot of times you'll see Venn diagrams used since the power is shared and the power is what only the federal or state government can do. And so here you have an example of federalism in a Venn diagram: national powers, state powers, and shared powers. All right, so concept 4, limited government. Limited government is a type of government in which the function and powers are written, limited, and restricted by law to protect the citizenry. So this government doesn't have all kinds of, powers, but they are specific and limited. And this prevents the abuse of power. So everybody has to abide by the law, including legislatures and presidents. It matters what the government should stay out of. Limited government was inspired by the Magna Carta. So that first time that the king was limited back in 1215 is still shown in our U.S. Constitution. And so concept 5 is popular sovereignty. This is government by the people. Examples are the consent of the governed and we the people, and you'll see that in the preamble of the Constitution, famously. And then concept 6. Concept 6 is republicanism. This is where people vote for representatives to make decisions and speak for them. Examples usually include vote, elect, choose. So very similar to popular sovereignty, but again, you're going to have those keywords about a representative government. And that's republicanism. And that takes us to our last concept today, and that's individual freedoms. So this was inspired by that early document, the English Bill of Rights. And it's defined by personal liberties and privileges that are protected. So these are what you'll see in the Bill of Rights, our own Bill of Rights. So the right to bear arms, the right to write newspaper articles, protest, petition the government. And again, those are found in the U.S. Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment famously protects the 5 freedoms that we call them: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition the government. However, there were a lot of people who wanted to support the ratification of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. Those were called Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were people who refused to support the ratification without the Bill of Rights, so they were Bill of Rights supporters. And again, inspired by the English Bill of Rights, and this was a process of amending the Constitution. So you'll see the elastic clause. This elastic clause, we want to write that down, the definition of that. This is a living document, we like to say. So amending the Constitution is written into the Constitution. We both have a process for amending the Constitution, and we give the government the power to pass any laws that are, very important, this part, necessary and proper, and that's the key word for the elastic clause. So we wanted to look into the future and be able to have a living document that could change with time, and it has done that. All right, guys, so that is your notes over the Constitution. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.